You have found the Thinking Mind podcast.
Today we have with us Kimberley Wilson. Kimberley's work looks at the role that food and lifestyle play in our mental health, including disordered eating, the gut-brain axis, and our emotional relationship with food. I also have with me today my fellow co-host Alex, who will be chipping in and asking some really interesting questions. So let's crack on. So, hello Kimberley, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm super excited to talk to you today, not just because we get to talk about psychiatry, but we're also going to talk about something that is so important to my life, and I'm sure almost everyone else's life, which is food. So I thought I would jump in straight away with quite a big question, which is, how does what we eat affect our mental health?
Okay, so I know you said we have an hour. I guess it makes sense to start chronologically because certainly from my perspective, food is central to mental health because it's central to brain health, and that starts pre-conception. So when we're thinking about the main period of brain development, it's in those early days and months from conception up until about the age of 2 or 3, when the biggest spurt of brain growth is happening. And so during that time, some key nutrients are absolutely essential. And they are broadly DHA, so omega-3 fatty acids, EPA, and another one called arachidonic acid. And arachidonic acid forms part of the epithelium of the vascular system, which obviously you have a brain that needs lots of energy and nutrients. It needs a very good blood supply. So you've got the fatty acids, iodine, which because of its role in metabolism and thyroxine production, is responsible for the density of neurons in the brain. And so we know that iodine deficiency is associated with lower IQ. And of course, at its extreme, it's associated with cretinism, which is a kind of real developmental delay. And then choline. So choline is required again because its derivatives form part of the membrane of your brain cell. So lots of different derivatives of choline. But also because when you link it with acetic acid, you get acetylcholine, which is a key neurotransmitter. All of these nutrients, I mean, choline can be upregulated during pregnancy, but they have to come from the diet. And if you're not getting sufficient amounts in the diet, then you're not getting good brain development. So that's just right from the beginning. I haven't even spoken about folic acid and all those things. That's just the start. And then you've got, childhood where, of course, you need to continue building the brain and building the resilience in terms of the structure and the function of the brain. Adolescence, when hormones kind of cascade into the brain and the brain is being pruned and reshaped, there's going to be particular needs around that. And then in terms of things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease, neurodegeneration, have midlife as a particular risk time. We need to be thinking about, how do I ensure that the changes that are happening in my brain now don't accumulate and become recognizable disease in 20 years' time? Because what we know about things like Alzheimer's disease is that although symptomology and diagnosis happens around 65, those brain changes are starting to accumulate from your 40s and 50s. So everything from conception to old age, nutrition is really important for brain health and mental health.
What foods are important in order for us to try and maintain a healthy mind?
Okay, so you can break it down into structure and function, right? So it's essentially, you've got to build the house and then it needs to work for you. You need to be able to move from room to room. You need to be able to have air flowing through and all of that sort of stuff. So structurally, again, things like the omega-3 fatty acids from oily fish and seafood, and they come packaged up with other really important cofactors like selenium and zinc and magnesium in those foods. And those are kind of I would consider the kind of structural, along with proteins and stuff, but most people aren't worried about low protein, form the structural basis. And then when you think about function, it's like, okay, I've got these brain cells in place. I've got these neuronal networks in place. How do they communicate? And of course, they communicate through neurotransmitters, these chemical signaling molecules, but they are made from nutrients too. And also the vesicles I don't know how in depth we can get on this, but so, the vesicles at the end of the axon terminal, which the sacs that contain the neurotransmitter, certainly in animal studies, when there is DHA deficiency, you have a 30% reduction in vesicle availability. And then also impaired communication across the synapse. So you need, again, these omega-3 fatty acids for the actual ability for those brain cells that are in place to send their messages to one another. And then there are other things like fiber, which I think is really underappreciated in terms of its role in protecting the brain, because fiber is metabolized in the gut. You get the production, one of the byproducts are these short chain fatty acids, which protect the endothelium of the blood-brain barrier. So these kind of direct and indirect ways that nutrition can protect your brain and help you to be well.
It's important you mention omega-3 and oily fish, because I'm going to put my hand up and say I don't eat fish.
Mm-hmm.
Is it possible that we can get that omega-3 and the nutrients that you just explained through multivitamin?
So
I'm a really fussy eater.
There are, broadly speaking, for our purposes, 3 types of omega-3 fatty acid. They're a little family of fatty acids, ALA, EPA, and DHA. So ALA is the type that's found in plant foods, walnuts and chia seeds and linseeds and that kind of thing. Then EPA and DHA are found in marine foods in their preformed form. So ALA, now very technically, we do have the pathway to convert ALA to EPA and DHA, which is the form you need for your brain. But the conversion rate is very, very poor. And also it is affected by a range of lifestyle and individual factors. So the version of a particular conversion gene that you have, the level of saturated fatty acids in your diet, all of that sort of stuff. So broadly speaking, no is the answer. Technically, yes, but actually in reality, in terms of clinical viability, you can't convert from ALA. So do eat ALA, eat your nuts and your seeds and things like that to get what you can. But if you don't eat any seafoods, if you're fussy or you're vegan or vegetarian or whatever it is, then an algae-based DHA supplement is the recommendation. And algae-based because essentially the algae is where the fish get it in the first place. It's synthesized in chloroplasts of algae, the DHA. The fish consume the algae, concentrate the fatty acids in their bodies. And so you're just kind of cutting out that middle process. So that would be the kind of recommendation if you don't eat any fish products, seafood products at all.
Just saying you have a specifically restrictive diet, such as the carnivore diet, and maybe by the look on your face, I want to ask you a little bit more about that diet as well. Can you get your nutrients as well as omega-3s from a multivitamin? And if you can't really, is there one that you would recommend is the most important that you can absorb? Because there's so much on the market at the moment. It's an absolute minefield.
So broadly speaking, you'll want to get your nutrients from whole foods. And that's purely and simply because that's the way your body is kind of developed to digest them. But also because there are hundreds, probably thousands of nutrients in particularly plant foods that haven't been isolated industrially, and therefore we can't put them in a pill yet. So the complex of nutrients that you'll get in a salad is quite different from getting vitamin C and vitamin E in a supplement. Mm-hmm. So I always say that as a caveat, because I do talk about supplements a fair amount, but I don't want to give the impression that, you can eat whatever you like, and if you're supplementing, you're fine.
Yeah.
That said, a recent study did come out about a month ago showing for the first time, because usually supplement trials in people who have a generally healthy diet don't do very much. But this was a study that used, and it was in America, so it was called Centrum Silver. So I know Centrum is available here, but I think it's called Centrum 50 Plus or something over here. And supplementation with Centrum did seem to slow cognitive decline in the elderly. And so I suppose what I would say is do your very best to get it from your diet. But if there are restrictions, limitations, whatever they are, problems with accessibility, then potentially a broad spectrum multi-nutrient, so vitamins, minerals, and omega-3s might be a good insurance policy, but don't depend on it as your main source of nutrition.
I think that makes complete sense. I'm just going to ask you quickly as well, because of your face that you pulled with the carnivore diet. what are your thoughts on the carnivore diet? I guess I don't know if you're able to explain exactly what it is because my knowledge isn't great. I think you just eat protein.
Different people have different variants of it. Some people allow, small amounts of what they consider to be ancestrally adequate plants. Some exclude all plants altogether. Some include dairy, some exclude dairy, but largely it's a kind of high protein, generally high fat diet. My concern comes back to something I said a little bit earlier, which is about the role of short chain fatty acids in the integrity of the blood-brain barrier. And the reason that that's important is because, essentially your brain is incredibly fragile. It's wonderful, but it's quite fragile. And your blood-brain barrier is this very highly selective barrier that stops things that are just, floating around in your bloodstream, crossing into the brain where it could just cause a problem or trigger your brain's innate immune cells. And we know that problems, breakdown in the integrity of the blood-brain barrier is a precursor of things like Alzheimer's disease. It turns up before you see key signs and symptoms of Alzheimer's. So there's quite a strong idea that it's one of the drivers of neurodegeneration is the breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. So I suppose my concern is if you have switched to a carnivore diet and you're not getting the substrate to feed your microbiome so that they can produce these short-chain fatty acids, the risk is that you're contributing to the degradation of your BBB. And that's notwithstanding, we don't have any long-term data on the long-term health consequences of being on a carnivore diet. What happens if you're not getting sufficient vitamin C? Are you supplementing with vitamin C? All of that sort of stuff. But also, what changes occur, because we know that the fastest way to change the composition of your microbiome is to change your diet, are the consequences of shifting your microbiome through this kind of high protein consumption and often a high red meat protein consumption. We don't know what the long-term consequences of that are. So it's a lot of kind of N of one trials that are being done, but I'm not sure what the outcome measures people are taking. Is it just weight loss that people are thinking about? Is it just their, blood fats or their blood glucose that they're thinking about? Is anybody really thinking about the downstream consequences on brain health?
I think that's so important, especially with social media and everything. I feel like short-term gains are so prominent and we're not really thinking, how's this going to affect us when we're 70 and potentially suffering with severe degenerative brain disease such as Alzheimer's? You mentioned the gut microbiome. I'm curious to know, how much do you think our gut can tell us about our mental health? A lot of people talk about IBS. How much of IBS do you think is related to our mental health?
This is a really lovely question, actually, because with IBS, and I guess if anybody's unfamiliar, irritable bowel syndrome is a functional gut disorder, and a functional gut disorder means that there is a problem with the function of the organ, with the system. But if you were to put a scope in there, if you to take a biopsy, then there doesn't seem to be any kind of organic disease or blockage. And what we know about IBS is there's quite a high comorbidity with mood disorders. Quite often it turns up with depression or anxiety.
That's something I've seen a lot.
But also that stress is one of the Rome criteria for a diagnosis of IBS. So it's understood to be a contributing factor. And it's really important that people know that, because we have such a dichotomy, such a kind of dissociation between the mind and the body. And I see this quite a lot, that as soon as something's happening in your gut, and it makes sense, you think, oh, maybe it's something I've eaten. Maybe I've developed a sensitivity to something. And this is where people become very vulnerable to online allergy testing, or whatever it might be. And what people tend to be tempted to do, or even encouraged to do by certain kind of online influencers, is to cut something out of their diet. So maybe I'll cut out gluten and see if that helps. And actually, that's more likely to lead to dysbiosis of your gut microbiome, which can then increase the severity of your symptoms. And then you still don't get any better, or you get some slight kind of relief for a little while, and then you feel bad again. And it can lead to this increasingly restrictive dietary intake, as well as increased stress about meal times. And so you can get this compounding effect. So I think it's really important that people understand that there is a very strong relationship between stress or psychology and something like IBS. And certainly when I'm working with IBS, understanding what their level of stress is one of the first things that we do. And one of the things you notice is that most people don't realize how stressed they are, that they're waking up, with their alarm screeching in their ear, jump out of bed, and then they're already thinking about the 700 things they have to get done. Then they're kind of on this maybe crowded commute, or they're doing a job that they don't really like, or study is really, really hard. And, all of these things. It's constant, and people don't realize that those things they're not just bouncing off them, they absolutely affect us. What was really interesting during the kind of height of the pandemic and lockdown was that people were coming to therapy and kind of complaining of feeling tired and complaining of feeling kind of a bit brain foggy, maybe. It's hard to concentrate. I don't know what's wrong with me. And they hadn't realized that they were responding. We're in this constant state of alert. It's going to make a difference to your stress resilience. So yes, really important. And therefore, either CBT, stress management, mindfulness, graded relaxation is a key component very often of interventions. Sometimes there's microbiome, like probiotic stuff as well, but certainly the psychological component needs to be at least assessed.
And you mentioned probiotics. Do we need probiotics? Are they useful?
The general consensus is if you do not have a diagnosed gut disorder, there really isn't that much benefit to you taking a probiotic supplement. You would be much better off, again, some very recent research indicates, increasing your consumption of fiber and fermented foods. That's likely to be a better option for you. Second part of that is that we really should be thinking about probiotics like drugs. You need to be thinking about what the illness or what the condition is that we're trying to address. Then what strain of bacteria has been indicated to be beneficial in that case? And then at what dose should it be administered? And then you need to make sure that you're getting a good enough, a high quality supplement where enough of the kind of colony forming units make it to the gut in order, so there's a lot to think about. And really, at the moment, only kind of gut specialist dietitians and professionals who have really thought about this or have access to the research are in a position to make that recommendation.
So would you not recommend people just going out and buying probiotics?
At the very least, you're probably wasting your money if you buy a poor quality supplement and you're just kind of making expensive poop. And at worst, you might just be, for example, if someone has a poorly functioning gut barrier, so similar to the blood-brain barrier, you've got this kind of lining of cells. They have these tight junctions on the lining of your gut. So there's the lining of your gut, then there's a mucus layer, a couple of mucus layers, and then there's the bacteria that live on that mucus layer and digest your food for you. If that barrier doesn't have much integrity, if it's degraded at all, and you get a loosening of those tight junctions, one of the problems is that bacteria can potentially cross that barrier into the bloodstream, where your immune cells, your white blood cells will find them and start an inflammatory cascade. And that is what you don't want to do. And that's why it's important to eat enough fiber, because fiber is one of the things that helps to maintain that gut barrier integrity. So the risk is, if you are someone who perhaps doesn't have a very good diet, but you've read lots of information about the potential benefit of probiotics, what you could be doing is throwing a bunch of new bacteria into a poorly functioning gut barrier and making the problem worse, because you're just injecting more bacteria and your immune cells are going to be on hyper. So focus on improving your diet, increasing your fiber intake. According to the National Diet Survey and Nutrition Survey, not a single age group in the UK is making the fiber recommendation. So before you start buying expensive probiotics, just eat some beans.
It's a lot cheaper.
It's much cheaper.
What kind of foods, just in case our listeners aren't aware, what foods are really full of fiber?
Beans and legumes are probably the best category. Because they have a combination of fibers, the kind of viscous gel forming ones, as well as the soluble fibers. They come packaged with little fat and lots of minerals and vitamins and stuff. So fiber is really important. Also, though, your alliums, so onions, leeks, they have lots of soluble fiber. Jerusalem artichokes, cereal, whole grain cereals. So cereal fiber has been shown to be really important. And I think it's less of an issue now, but in the height of when people were avoiding gluten, that was a big concern of mine, was that people were actually cutting out a really important source of cereal fiber from their diet. So whole grain, oats, wheat, rye, barley, so multi-grain porridges and brown rice and brown pasta, those sorts of things.
You mentioned the gluten intolerance. Is there evidence to suggest that a lot of people do have this bloat secondary to gluten?
So yes and no. So the yes part is certainly celiacs, right? Absolutely. You have a genetic allergy to gluten and you must not, cannot, should not eat gluten. After that, things get a little bit more complicated. So there's a group of people who seem to have a non-celiac gluten sensitivity. They seem to have some sensitivity to gluten. We're not really sure, but they seem to be quite a small group. So, certainly something like 1 or 2% of the population, certainly much less than the number of people who would self-describe or disclose as having an issue with gluten. Then after that, we get into the realm of expectation and nocebo effects. This is, I think, really important for people to understand. This has been tested in, double-blinded, randomized trials. You take a group of people who have self-described as having gluten sensitivity or, getting bloated or unwell or pain after consuming gluten. And you split them into two groups and you have one group eat a gluten-free cereal bar, and with the other group, you're kind of testing their response and you give them a cereal bar that contains some gluten. And in the gluten containing bar, you get measurable symptoms. People bloat, they feel discomfort, they feel maybe tenderness. And then actually you tell them there was no gluten in this product at all. So one of two things seems to be happening. One is that we call the expectation effect or the nocebo effect, is that when you believe there is going to be a negative outcome of a food or of a medication. So if you've read side effects of your medication and you've looked them up online and you've heard your friends talk about it, then it increases the likelihood that you will experience it because your brain works on prediction. Your brain is always predicting. And the other possibility is that it's not actually the gluten that people might be responding to. It might be another group of soluble sugars called fructans, which feed the gut microbiome, but they as a consequence, they produce lots of gas. It might not be the gluten, it might be the fructans. And so you might be able to eat gluten-containing foods, but reduce your intake of fructan-containing foods. But again, that's not something that's particularly well known unless you go and see a gut specialist.
One of many things I also want to ask you about is the effect of caffeine on our mental health and our gut. Is it good for our mental health? Is it good for our gut?
So certainly, if we start with the gut, caffeine can increase the movement of food through your gut. So lots of people are familiar with that, the coffee poo. That's usually not, there's nothing kind of mechanically or biologically wrong with that. There doesn't seem to be anything risky. When it comes to the brain or kind of more general effects, some people are going to be genetically predisposed to be kind of slow metabolizers of caffeine. And so they tend to be the people who say, oh, I can't drink coffee, it just makes me feel sick, or it makes me feel really jittery, or it just makes me feel horrible. And in which case, if that's how it makes you feel, don't drink it. There's some evidence that you can perhaps slightly improve your tolerance of it, but it's probably not worth it. But other than that, and I suppose notwithstanding the sugar and the cream or whatever you might be adding to your coffee, if we're thinking about coffee itself, pretty much all the research indicates that if you're not sensitive to it, coffee is neuroprotective. It's seen to be associated with reduced risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, enhancement or protection of cognitive functions, slower cognitive decline, up to around 3 or 4 cups per day, again, depending on your strength. If you go over that, then you're at risk of things like caffeine-induced anxiety, but 2 or 3 cups should be a sweet spot for most people, again, as long as it's not disturbing your sleep.
Because sleep is so important. I'm glad you've brought it up. How much sleep should we be getting in order to maintain a healthy brain? And what is the effect of having not enough sleep?
There isn't really a magic number, except to say that most people who think they can get by on 4 hours sleep are just kidding themselves. It's a very small proportion of people who can get by, naturally, again, genetically short sleepers in the kind of 4 hour range, but that's less than 1% of the population. So if that's not you,
it's not me.
Don't do that. Like, there's nothing big or clever about trying to get by on, deliberately get by on not much sleep. After that, really, the way we work out how much sleep you need is almost to say, if you didn't have to get up in the morning for a particular time, if you had, say, 3 days where you go to bed whenever you started to feel tired, and then you woke up in the morning and felt refreshed, whatever that number of hours is the amount of sleep that you need. So often if people are on holiday, after the first couple of days when you're getting over work exhaustion, that's quite a nice time to kind of test what your sleep need is. What time do I naturally feel sleepy? And then how much sleep do I need to have in order to feel refreshed in the morning? That is my number. And that should be the number that you try to stick to as much as possible. Now, the problem of inadequate sleep, or the problems of inadequate sleep, are many and profound. In terms of function, or kind of psychological well-being, we know that inadequate sleep impairs your ability to assess risk. You make more risky decisions when you are underslept, and you have much poorer mood stability. Your mood is much more labile when you are underslept, both in terms of increased risk of depression and low mood, but also that kind of, you get kind of manic and a bit mad when you're a bit underslept. It's just not great, and you don't have insight often as well. That's the thing about drowsy driving. That you're drowsy, but you also don't realize how drowsy you are and how impaired your reaction times are. But in terms of the mechanism, which is quite scary, and I don't necessarily want to terrify people, but it is true. After quite severe sleep deprivation, to be fair, quite severe sleep deprivation, your brain can start kind of cannibalizing itself. Brain cells start to break down, which you don't want, but in a less extreme way, more generally. One of what we understand to be the main functions of sleep seems to be the clearance of the buildup of metabolic waste. As a normal byproduct of your very, very hungry, very active brain working, you get this buildup of a range of kind of metabolic products. And one of those is a protein called amyloid beta. And this is a protein that builds up between brain cells in the synapse. And it's cleared during the day, but its clearance rate is doubled during deep sleep, when actually the synapses pull back by about 60%. Cerebrospinal fluid flows in and seems to flush it away. So you kind of get this deep, clean process effect that happens during deep sleep. And the reason that that's important is because amyloid beta is one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease. It's not clear how causal the relationship is, but we certainly see an association between sleep problems and sleep disorders and increased Alzheimer's disease risk. And it may be, for example, that it is partly the buildup of amyloid that leads to Alzheimer's, and or that an Alzheimer's diseased brain finds it difficult to generate quality sleep. And so you end up in this kind of vicious cycle. They kind of feed back on each other. But where possible, and as early as possible, make sure you're taking care of your sleep. Try to be aware. One of the things people often underestimate is the impact of getting up to go to the toilet in the middle of the night. So don't drink too much before you go to bed. That can be something that just disrupts your sleep unnecessarily. But also the impact of sound. Certainly I have found that I'm much more sensitive than I thought. I was like, I'm a Londoner, I'm fine, I can handle a bit of noise. Not at all.
I found I'm really receptive to light as well. And I've only really found that since I did night shifts. I don't know if it's just because I've changed rooms or something. But in the summer, when the sun comes up really early, I am awake and there's nothing I can do about it.
Andrew Huberman, the neurobiologist from Stanford, he talks all about light and its relationship to sleep. And he says one of the first things you should do in the morning is try and get exposed to blue light from the sky, go outside, and that kind of sets a timer such that 16 to 18 hours later, you're more likely to go into a deep sleep. And then he says also to avoid light from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., something like that, to preserve sleep. Can I share with you how I think about my sleep? And please tell me what you think. Because anyone who knows me knows I'm a big fan of sleep. I always thought the notion that you're jolted out of sleep in the morning by an alarm is kind of absurd. And kind of by definition, if you're waking up with an alarm, you're not getting enough sleep because you're not waking up naturally. So somewhere around my late 20s, I just stopped setting alarms in the morning, unless I have something very important like an exam or have to go to the airport. I just don't set an alarm. And if I wake up late and I'm late for work, so be it. I've paid the price. And this will be for like a day or 2 days. And then if I'm late for work, I just make myself sleep earlier that day. And I keep going until I wake up naturally. And nowadays, most days just wake up naturally early enough. And so there's kind of a self-correcting mechanism where if I'm oversleeping in the morning, it's because I'm not sleeping early enough. And so I never find myself in sort of a chronic sleep debt situation. And then I've had periods like last April, I didn't sleep enough for like 2 weeks in a row because of a lot of stuff that was going on. And I felt the sleep debt build up. And then I felt that for 2 weeks after that, I overslept for like another 2 weeks until I was back to my normal. And I think people are in a state of chronic sleep debt without realizing it for like years.
For sure. Yeah, no, I mean, that's commitment. I think I was with you right up until the point of being late for work. I completely agree with you. And ideally, this is how it would be. I completely feel that it's a luxury that I can. I've also organized my life. I've augmented my life so that I can. So my clinic days start kind of later in the morning and I finish quite late. I finish at kind of 8 p.m. so that I can wake up naturally. And then because I don't tend to get tired until about 11 o'clock. So that works kind of fine.
Yeah.
But ideally, if more people could be just waking up naturally after they've had enough sleep and had a refreshed sleep, and maybe, I mean, in an ideal world, working days would be staggered so that your morning people can get there at 6, 7, 8 when it suits them and do their working day, and your kind of moderate or evening people will get there at 10 and work a longer day because it suits their chronotype. And actually the work still gets done, but people aren't forcing themselves into desynchrony.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be my kind of ideal scenario. Let people choose a time of working that suits their biology.
I would happily go in early. I'll take one for the team. I'm such a morning person.
I'll take the night shift. It works.
We're done. Moving on from sleep, unless there's anything else you want to ask, Alec. I want to know what's the effect on alcohol and what kind of alcohol, if any, can we drink?
It's a really controversial area in the terms of there seems to be a fair amount of conflicting information. So I will set out the controversies. And the first thing to say is that...
Sorry to interrupt. This is Johann Sebastian Bach. And as a fan of the show, I'd like to encourage you to follow and subscribe wherever you listen. If you like the show, you can share it with a friend. And if you'd like to support the team, you can buy them a coffee using the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes. As always, they'd love to hear from you. So if you have any feedback, you can follow them on social media, or you can email the team at podcast@maudslearning.com.
Fundamentally, we know that ethanol, alcohol itself, is a neurotoxin. We know that. There's no disputing. Anybody who's out there and you don't drink and then you read something that says, maybe a small amount of alcohol is good for the brain, don't start drinking. The other thing to say is that we know that certainly around 10% of dementia cases are ARBD, they're alcohol-related brain disease, and that alcohol reduces the levels of thiamine in the body, and thiamine deficiency leads to brain disorders and cognitive decline. So we know that for sure. The controversy is in the J-shaped curve of alcohol consumption. So that is that teetotalers seem to have a slightly elevated above average risk. Then people who have a small amount of alcohol, and particularly in relation to the Mediterranean diet, seems to be red wine, seem to have a reduced risk. And then the risk goes up, and it kind of almost goes up exponentially with greater alcohol consumption. The difficulty is understanding the elevated risk for teetotalers, because is it saying that there is some benefit to alcohol consumption, that if you're not getting it, you're missing out? Or is it about the sick quitters? People, so, a bunch of teetotalers might be teetotal for religious reasons or personal reasons and cultural reasons, but some of them might be recovering alcoholics or people who have chosen to stop drinking because they were drinking so much that it was doing them harm. And if that's the case, they might have already developed signs of physical or neurological disease that is being picked up in the studies when we're saying, well, how many teetotalers end up with dementia? The other possibility is that maybe there's, the polyphenols in red wine might be doing something at a very small intake. Then again, it could be that that's all confounded by the other beneficial protective factors of the Mediterranean lifestyle, which is lots of leafy vegetables and nuts, walking and sunshine and a relaxed, a slower pace of life. Broadly, I would say, if you do drink, most people need to drink less, probably. Most people drink more than the recommended amount. If you do drink, try to drink less and maybe try to make it red wine. But you're probably fine not drinking at all, and certainly don't drink for the potential benefits.
You mentioned the Mediterranean diet, and in my own personal experience, I've Googled what's the best diet for you. And almost all the time it comes up with Mediterranean, which I can appreciate. I've also read that the Mediterranean diet 20 years ago is not the same as the Mediterranean diet that we necessarily think it is today.
As a Mediterranean, I can confirm that to be the case. I come from Malta, which has one of the highest obesity rates in Europe.
Is the Mediterranean diet the best diet that you would recommend? And if so, what exactly do you mean by the Mediterranean diet?
Sure. So the Mediterranean diet it's the one that's most recommended because it's the one that's most studied, I think. When we're thinking about brain health, the evidence seems to be wherever you are, whether it's Scandinavia, whether it's Italy, whether it's Japan, whether it's Brazil, the more that you adhere to your nation's recommendations for a healthy diet, which broadly tends to be a whole food intake. So fruits and vegetables, low intake of fried, sweetened, ultra-processed foods, making sure you're getting your beans and your nuts and your seeds and, that sort of stuff. And again, hardly anybody does. Hardly anybody is adhering to the basic guidelines. Like I said, in the UK, something like 30% of people are getting their 5 a day, which was kind of the minimum set by Sacken, because they thought that would be attainable. Anything more would freak people out. And so they said, well, look, just aim for 5, and we're still not managing 5. The recommendation is to not eat that too many sweet things, and we're eating sweet things almost every day. But yes, the more you stick to a whole food, plant heavy diet, not necessarily plant exclusive, but leaning on the plants the most, lower your risk of developing depression and slower the rate of cognitive decline. So wherever you are, trying to reduce your intake of sweetened and ultra processed foods and focusing more on trying to get more fruits and vegetables into your diet and more fiber, and certainly from my perspective, omega-3 fats, those are going to be the things. It's about the things that you're including, which is going to keep you on the right track.
You mentioned sugar. Are we addicted to sugar? How do you know if you're addicted to sugar? If we are addicted to sugar, how can we help ourselves?
Gosh, this is another really controversial question. Because it's about how people quantify the notion of addiction. Often people will kind of say, well, when you give people sugar, it lights up the reward centers of the brain and it produces dopamine and endorphins, just like cocaine does. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, but we're evolved to find eating pleasurable so that we don't die. So it's kind of essential.
Yeah.
We are driven to consume it in order to, make sure we get sufficient nutrient intake to live. On that, though, there is the idea that, whilst we might have had an inbuilt preference for sugar, for example, so that we would be drawn to tubers and honey back in our ancestral days, what we didn't have was the ability to extract and concentrate sugar and then put it in other places like we do now. What we have is an inbuilt preference, which is heightened in a food environment where sugar can be concentrated and added in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is the feeling that you're addicted doesn't necessarily mean that you are addicted. So that feeling of having an urge or feeling compelled might not necessarily be the same as what we consider to be a chemical or physical addiction when we think about things like drugs.
Yeah.
So I'm less inclined to use the phrase addiction. I can certainly understand that people feel very compelled to eat these foods and they feel very driven to, and they have very strong urges. But often you can work with urges, and often you can rebalance and retrain your palate. Enough consistency, you can retrain your palate so that you can enjoy less sweet foods and crave them less, and enjoy other alternatives.
You're right in terms of the craving and the habituals. It's quite different to alcohol addiction and drug addictions that we tend to see in mental health services. One last question that I have that I'm just interested in, because I'm currently working on an anxiety disorders unit and we use a lot of antidepressants. And I was just wondering if there's evidence to suggest that it may be helpful for individuals for anxiety and depression, but actually the negative effects that it has on the gut microbiome. How's that interlinked? Do we know yet, or is that something that we just need to look into a bit more?
I'm not sure we do, and I guess it depends on kind of which specific drug you're talking about. But one of the proposed, because there's lots of big questions, particularly when it comes to SSRIs, around the serotonin hypothesis of depression to start with. How does it work? Is it working? Is it working better than placebo? For which group of patients? For the people for whom it does work, one of the possibilities is that it works through reshaping the microbiome. So there was an indication that SSRIs might reshape the microbiome to be anti-inflammatory, or to kind of give slightly different signals via the gut-brain axis, the vagus nerve, to the brain. So it's possible that it works through that means. But again, I'm inclined, and I have to hold up my hands to my particular bias here. There was a systematic review and meta-analysis which found that when there are certain nutraceuticals, so folic acid, vitamin D, and omega-3, so DHA, alongside antidepressant medication, increase their efficacy. So I have to start thinking about, well, what is it that the SSRI is? What is its function? What is it doing? Is it something about, improving the functionality of the neurotransmitter synthesis? And as we come back to the kind of vesicles, and the vesicles needing DHA and all of that. I think there's much to think about. And I think certainly we need more effective strategies and interventions, whether that's better targeting of medication or better understanding of the underlying pathology of depression and anxiety. I don't think that's properly outlined. With something like 30% treatment resistant depression, we certainly need to be thinking much more holistically about treatment interventions for patients.
Yeah, I agree. I think we're currently starting to think about it, but then the evidence has to catch up and the trials have to catch up, and hopefully in 15 years time we'll have a bit more of a better understanding about the causes and the treatment and how they all interact together, especially for things like depression, which is so multifactorial. We know that depression means so many different things for a lot of people and presents in so many different ways, and is also so many different causes, and therefore so many different treatments. But that's a whole nother conversation for a
whole other episode.
I have 1,000 questions. We will have to have you back, but if I could just ask one today. And we've talked a lot about the technicalities of diet and nutrition, and I would encourage people to read your book so they can get more of a comprehensive look into that. And we've talked a lot about what foods are good, and we've hinted at what foods are bad. But my question is, for people who present with sort of the standard Western diet, a lot of junk food, not a lot of nutritious food. I know you're a psychologist by background. What kind of psychological techniques, mindsets are helpful? Because at the end of the day, you can give someone a list, don't eat this, eat this. But we know that's not very effective. Psychologically, changing your diet is very difficult. So if someone's coming in with quite a poor diet and they want to make that shift, towards a long-term lifestyle change, how do they think about that? How do they start to begin that process, psychologically speaking?
So there are a few things that I would start with. In my book, initially I'd had it as the first chapter, but my editor thought that would be off-putting. But it was like all the reasons why you won't implement this information in this book. It's a list of cognitive bias that get in the way of us making or sticking to behavioral change, including things like, the anchoring bias. Oh, well, my grandma had bacon and brandy for breakfast and she lived to 107, this kind of thing where, oh, it's never going to, optimism bias, it's not going to be happen to me, I'm going to be fine, all of this. So I outlined those, but I think in terms of implementing strategies, there are a few things that you can do that are helpful. The first is make a list of all the hard things you have ever done. Changing your diet is difficult, and it's difficult because we eat habitually. You eat the food you've habitually eaten, often for decades. And actually, our taste preferences start to be developed in utero. So there's a long period of laying down these preferences that takes a bit of effort to break. So it's hard for that reason. Let's accept that it's hard. But you've done hard things. And so it's useful for people to start out by reminding themselves of all the hard stuff you've done. Have you done a degree? Then you did something really difficult every day for 3 or 4 years, if not more. One person said, my first day of school when I was 7 years old, how tough it is to go into school and, present yourself to the rest of your class. There are so many difficult things that you have done that you forget. And you forget then that you are capable of consistency, and you're capable of applying effort, and you're capable of withstanding urges, and you're capable of working through. So write a list. These are the hard things that I can do. The other thing is to beware of your own BS. So at some point, you're going to come up to a situation where you'll say, oh, it's not really that important, or I just fancy, whatever it might be. And just, again, make another list. Here are the rubbish excuses that I'm going to come up with for myself to not implement whatever this change is. And once you've written them down, it's almost like you kind of like, you can't take yourself seriously. You're like, oh, I couldn't eat a salad because it was raining outside. That's it.
I literally felt like that yesterday. I literally was like, it's cold, I don't want to eat a salad.
Eat the salad, Rebecca. Eat the salad.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, completely.
I mean, it's fine. Comfort food is, again, a different conversation. But as a kind of crude example, sometimes you'll come up with rubbish excuses not to eat a good thing, a thing that's going to be part of what you want to help improve your brain health. And then the final thing, and probably the most important alongside, is to make it as easy as possible. So the other thing that's really hard is that often people think that they have to completely overhaul their entire eating, start something brand new. And the thing is that the way we eat is part of our identity. So if you completely change the way you eat overnight, it feels like you don't know who you are. So I recommend just starting out with something simple. So if, say, you know that you drink too many sugar sweetened beverages, like, oh, I know that I drink too many. The idea of switching to plain water feels like hell. Let's accept that. Then just switch one. If you have 2 cans a day, then just switch out 1 can a week. Let's start there. And make them small changes. And in the book, I recommend tiny things like, if you eat cornflakes for breakfast, just add a sliced banana to your cornflakes. You don't have to change. You don't have to overnight start eating gruel because it's better for you. Just eat what you like, but make it a little bit better. If you make bolognese, add a handful of cooked lentils to increase the fiber, or switch the white pasta to brown pasta and keep everything else the same. Make the changes so small that it's almost ridiculous not to do them.
When I'm prescribing exercise to people, I tell them do 5 push-ups.
Exactly.
Again, it's like so ridiculous. But then the weird thing is you do 5 push-ups, you get the dopamine flowing in your reward system. You're like, oh, maybe I'll do another 5. And at the end of the day, the first workout, if you're going to work out for 5 years, the first workout is irrelevant. What's the content of it? And similarly to what you're saying, if you're truly going to change your diet and your lifestyle, let's say for the next 10 years, what do you do on that first day is irrelevant. That's just the first step to get you going. And like you say, if you can make it gradual and almost imperceptible, the easier it is. But I think people struggle with having the long-term vision.
Yeah.
They struggle to be humble about their goals. They often start a dietary change when they hit a low point, and to sort of fight against that low point, they have this urge to do something radical, as you mentioned, but it just probably won't work. It really has to be that slow and steady approach.
Yeah, because because quite often we use pain as a motivator, like I hate feeling like this, or I hate the shape that I'm in, I hate da. But at some point you're not going to keep hating yourself or hating where you are. And so you can't use pain as the motivator. Pain will stop being the motivator after a certain amount of time. And good, because actually it's not a great motivator. And actually you're much better off if you can come around to a position of kindness and compassion. I care about myself. I care about my future. And this is why I want to make this shift.
Kimberley Wilson, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I am so grateful. I've absolutely loved talking to you today. Is there any last thing that you'd want to say to our listeners before you go?
I would just say I'm very concerned about the number of children in food insecurity in the UK. And it's something we should be worried about, not just because of the long-term physical health implications, but because we know that child hunger is a source of chronic stress. It is an insult to dignity. It impairs children's concentration. It takes away an hour of learning time every day. And so as much as I think it's important for us to be thinking about, ourselves and our adult brains and our long-term brain health and not getting dementia and all of this sort of stuff, if you can write to your MP or donate to a food bank or donate to a children's breakfast club, I would just encourage people to think about it, because the long-term well-being of the nation is children's health, and we really need to start thinking about that.
Yeah, that's so important. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kimberley.
Thank you. Where can people find you?
I mostly hang out on Instagram, where I am at Food and Psych. But I suppose if you wanted kind of signposting to everything, my website is kimberleywilson.co.
Thank you so much.
You are listening to the Thinking Mind podcast.
If you enjoyed today's podcast, we'd love it if you share it with a friend, or you could give us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. If you fancy it, you can even buy us a coffee to support the team, and the links for that will be in the show notes. Thanks for listening.